They said he was too fat to ride a horse. The whole town laughed when Henry Dalton stepped off that train in Montana Territory, 1888, a mail-order husband so heavy he couldn't mount a saddle. His bride, Beatrice Lane, felt her dreams crumble into dust. But when a winter blizzard swallowed her whole and left her for dead 6 miles from home, this man they all mocked did something no one expected. He walked, every agonizing step through hell itself, just to find her. Stay with me until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The telegram had arrived on a Tuesday morning in early September, carried by a rider whose horse kicked up dust devils along the dry Montana road. Beatrice Lane stood on the porch of her late father's ranch house, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron, watching that dust cloud grow closer with a mixture of hope and dread that had become as familiar to her as breathing. She was 26 years old, practically a spinster by frontier standards, and the ranch her father had left her was slowly dying. 300 acres of stubborn land that demanded more labor than her small frame could provide, more capital than her empty purse could produce. The cattle were down to 40 head. The fences sagged like old men's shoulders, and the bank in Red Valley had made it crystal clear, marry or sell. Those were her options. So she had done what desperate women had done for decades along this harsh frontier. She had placed an advertisement. Wanted. Hardworking rancher seeks wife. Must be strong, sober, and of good moral character. Land and home provided. Serious inquiries only. She'd received 3 responses. The first was from a man who could barely spell his own name. The second was from someone who wanted to know if she was pretty enough to make the journey worthwhile. She'd burned that letter immediately. The third had been different. Henry Dalton's letter had been carefully penned, each word chosen with obvious thought. He wrote of growing up in Ohio, of losing his family's farm to debt, of heading west with nothing but hope and a strong back. He mentioned his size only once, almost apologetically. I am a larger man than most, which has made finding work on horseback difficult, but I'm tireless on my feet and can work from sunup to sundown without complaint. His honesty had touched something in her. His mention of books, he'd read Cooper and Irving, had intrigued her, and his closing line had sealed her decision. I am not a handsome man or a wealthy one, but I am a man of my word, and if you'll have me, I will spend every day proving you made the right choice. They had exchanged 4 more letters over 6 weeks. She had learned that he was 32, that he loved his mother's memory fiercely, that he had a quiet sense of humor that emerged in unexpected moments. She had told him about the ranch, about her father's death from pneumonia the previous winter, about her fear of losing the only home she'd ever known. And now he was coming. The telegram was brief. Arriving Red Valley Station September 18th. Stop. 2 p.m. train. Stop yours in hope. Henry Dalton, stop. September 18th was tomorrow. Beatrice had barely slept that night. She'd cleaned the house until every surface gleamed, baked bread and a dried apple pie, pressed her best dress, a blue calico that brought out her eyes, and braided her dark hair so tightly her scalp ached. She had rehearsed a dozen different greetings, each one feeling more foolish than the last. What did you say to a stranger you were about to marry? The ride into Red Valley took 90 minutes, her mare picking her way along the rutted road while Beatrice's stomach performed acrobatics. The town was small even by frontier standards, 2 streets that crossed at a general store, a saloon, a church, the train station, and a scattering of houses that thinned out into prairie grass and endless sky. She arrived 30 minutes early and waited on the platform, the September sun beating down with late summer fury. A few other people gathered as departure time approached. Old Mr. Henderson collecting a shipment of lumber, the widow Morrison meeting her sister from Kansas, and a cluster of ranch hands with nothing better to do than loiter and comment on every petticoat that passed by. Beatrice felt their eyes on her, heard their whispers. Everyone in Red Valley knew why she was there. Small towns had no secrets, only delayed revelations. That's the Lane girl, someone murmured, waiting on that mail-order husband. Desperate times, another voice replied, not unkindly. Can't run a ranch alone, that's for sure. The train whistle screamed in the distance, a lonely sound that made something in Beatrice's chest tighten. This was really happening. In a few minutes, she would meet the man she'd agreed to marry, based on nothing but letters and hope and the terror of losing everything. The locomotive appeared first, a black beast belching smoke and steam, dragging its chain of passenger cars with mechanical indifference. The squeal of brakes, the hiss of steam, the conductor's call. Red Valley Station! Beatrice's hands were shaking. She clasped them together, forced her spine straight. Passengers began to emerge, a family with 3 children, 2 men in business suits, an elderly woman requiring assistance down the steps. And then Henry Dalton stepped onto the platform. The first thing Beatrice noticed was his size. The letters hadn't prepared her. He was massive. Not just tall, though he stood well over 6 feet, but wide in a way that made door frames look insufficient. His shoulders were broad as an ox yoke, his chest like a barrel, his waist thick enough that she could have wrapped her arms around it twice. His face was round and flushed from the heat, sweat already beading on his forehead beneath a hat that looked too small for his head. He clutched a battered carpet bag in one hand and held his hat in the other, his eyes scanning the platform with obvious anxiety. When they found her, and somehow, despite never having seen each other, they both knew, his face transformed. The anxiety melted into something gentler. He smiled, and it was the same smile she'd imagined while reading his letters, full of warmth and honest hope. But before Beatrice could smile back, before she could step forward and introduce herself, the laughter started. It began with the ranch hands, of course. A snicker, quickly suppressed. Then another, less successfully hidden. Within seconds, the entire platform seemed to ripple with poorly concealed amusement. "Good Lord," someone said, not quite quietly enough. "That's a big man." "Big? That's a damn mountain. How's he going to climb into a saddle? Need a crane?" "That's her husband? The Lane Ranch is saved. They can butcher him for beef." The laughter grew louder, more brazen. Henry's smile faded. His face reddened further, but he didn't look away from Beatrice. He walked toward her, his gait slightly rolling, the walk of a heavy man in a world built for lighter frames, and with each step, the mockery swelled. "Better reinforce them floorboards, Miss Lane. Hope you got a strong bed frame. He'll break every horse on the ranch before the honeymoon." Beatrice felt her own face burning. She had expected a rancher, someone weathered and lean like all the men who worked this land. She had not expected this. Her eyes darted to the watching faces, saw the grins, the nudged elbows, the open amusement, and something inside her curdled with shame. Henry stopped 3 feet away. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a warm brown, that his hands, though large, looked gentle, that despite his size and the cruel laughter, there was no anger in his expression, only a kind of weary resignation, as though he'd heard all this before and had learned to expect nothing better. "Miss Lane," he said, and his voice was surprisingly soft, cultured even, with a Midwestern flatness to the vowels. "I'm Henry Dalton. It's a genuine pleasure to finally meet you." He didn't offer his hand. Perhaps he feared she wouldn't take it, not with the whole town watching. The laughter had subsided to whispers now. But those were almost worse, the sibilant sound of mockery trying to disguise itself as conversation. Beatrice opened her mouth. She meant to say something welcoming, something warm, that would acknowledge all those letters and the courage it must have taken for him to come here. But what came out was stilted, formal. "Mr. Dalton, welcome to Red Valley." Something flickered in his eyes. Disappointment, maybe, or just recognition. He nodded slowly. "Thank you, ma'am." He paused, then added, almost apologetically, "I may not be fast, but I'll always get there." It was such an odd thing to say that Beatrice didn't know how to respond. She simply nodded and gestured toward the general store where she'd tied her horse. "I have the wagon. Your things?" "Just this." He lifted the carpet bag. Everything he owned in the world, apparently, fit in one small bag. They walked through town together, the large man and the slender woman, and Beatrice felt the eyes following them every step of the way. She heard the whispers, the barely suppressed laughter, and with each sound her shame grew deeper, more toxic. What had she done? The wagon waited behind Henderson's store. It was a simple farm wagon, the bed empty except for a few sacks of flour she'd purchased that morning. Henry looked at it for a long moment, then at the horse in the traces. Beatrice's bay mare, Sally, who was already rolling her eyes nervously at his approach. "I can drive." Beatrice said quickly. If you'd like to ride in the back. Henry shook his head. No need, I'll walk. Walk? It's 10 miles to the ranch. I know. His smile was gentle, almost apologetic. But Sally there doesn't look like she'd appreciate carrying both of us, and I don't mind the exercise. Before Beatrice could argue, he'd set off down the road, his gait steady despite his size. She climbed onto the wagon seat, took up the reins, and followed him at a walk, too stunned to protest further. They traveled in silence for the first mile. Henry walked with his head up, his carpet bag swinging in one hand, apparently unbothered by the heat or the distance. Beatrice watched him from the wagon seat, her emotions a confused tangle she couldn't begin to sort. Finally, she couldn't stand it anymore. Mr. Dalton? Henry, he said, not looking back. If we're to be married, you should call me Henry. Henry. The name felt strange on her tongue, too intimate for this man she didn't know. You don't have to walk. I didn't mean… I know you didn't. He glanced back then, and his smile held no resentment. But it's easier this way. For you and for Sally. Besides, I like walking, gives me time to think, and the countryside's beautiful. They fell silent again. Beatrice found herself studying him as they traveled, this puzzle of a man who seemed entirely unaffected by the cruelty he'd just endured. He pointed out birds she named for him, meadowlarks and red-tailed hawks, and asked questions about the land they passed, the condition of the grass, the water sources, all the practical concerns of ranching. By the third mile, despite herself, Beatrice was answering more freely, talking about the ranch, its challenges, its possibilities. Henry listened with genuine interest, asking intelligent questions that revealed he knew more about cattle and land management than his letters had suggested. Your father sounds like he was a good man, Henry said, after she'd told him about the ranch's history. Building something out here, making it last, that takes real strength. He was strong, Beatrice agreed, something loosening in her chest. Strongest man I ever knew. Henry was quiet for a moment, then said softly, Strength comes in different forms, Miss Lane. The kind that builds fences isn't always the same kind that keeps them standing. Before she could ask what he meant, they crested a rise and the ranch came into view. It wasn't much, a simple two-story house with a wide porch, a barn that leaned slightly to the east, a scattering of outbuildings, and beyond them, rolling grassland that stretched to the mountains on the horizon. 300 acres of stubborn hope. Henry stopped, and for the first time since leaving town, Beatrice saw real emotion cross his face. Something that might have been longing, or perhaps just recognition. The look of a man who'd finally found something he'd been searching for. It's beautiful, he said simply. Beatrice felt a lump rise in her throat. It's falling apart. That can be fixed. He turned to her then, his brown eyes steady. If you'll let me try, there it was again. That gentle insistence, that quiet determination that seemed to exist independently of his body, as though his spirit and his flesh were somehow separate things. Beatrice began, but the sound of hoofbeats interrupted her. 3 riders approached from the direction of town, moving fast. As they drew closer, Beatrice recognized them. Jake Morrison and his brothers, Pete and Tom. They worked on the Morrison Ranch 3 sections over and were known for their skill with horses and their love of whiskey and trouble, usually in that order. Jake pulled up beside the wagon, his horse dancing sideways. He was grinning, a mean edge to it that Beatrice had learned to recognize. Well, well, he drawled, pushing his hat back. If it ain't Miss Lane and her new… what should we call him? Husband? Or just burden? His brothers laughed. Henry, Beatrice noticed, had gone very still. Move along, Jake, Beatrice said, trying to keep her voice level. We're going home. Home! Jake's grin widened. That's rich. Tell me, Lane, how's he going to work a ranch if he can't even sit a horse? Going to follow the cattle on foot? Herd them by waddling after them? Pete chimed in. Maybe he can just lie down in front of them, make a wall they can't get through. More laughter. Tom rode his horse in a circle around Henry, who stood motionless, his expression carefully blank. I'm curious, Jake continued, addressing Henry directly now. You ever actually been on a horse? Or do they all collapse when they see you coming? Henry's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but clear. I'm not much of a rider, that's true. but I get where I'm going. Yeah? And where's that? The dinner table? Jake slapped his thigh, delighted with his own wit. Lord, Lane, I can't believe you ordered this one. What did you use, a catalog for circus attractions? Something in Beatrice snapped. That's enough. But Jake was on a roll now, encouraged by his brother's laughter, by the way Henry just stood there taking it. I'm doing you a favor, Miss Lane. See, I could have courted you myself, saved you from this. He gestured at Henry, struggling for words. What even are you, Dalton? You sure ain't a man. Not a real one. The silence that followed was sharp as broken glass. Henry's face didn't change. He simply looked at Jake with those steady brown eyes and said, You finished? Excuse me? Are you finished? Henry repeated. Because Miss Lane and I have work to do, and you're blocking the road. Jake's grin faltered. He wasn't used to his target standing their ground, even verbally. You trying to give me orders? Just stating a fact. Henry shifted his carpetbag to his other hand. You're in the way. For a moment, Beatrice thought Jake might actually do something violent. His hand moved toward the gun on his hip, his face flushing dark red. But then Tom touched his brother's shoulder, murmured something low, and Jake seemed to reconsider. You ain't worth it, Jake spat. He yanked his horse's head around viciously enough to make the animal toss its head in protest. Come on, boys, let's leave the happy couple to their misery. They rode off in a cloud of dust and laughter, and when they were gone, silence settled over the prairie like snow. Beatrice climbed down from the wagon, her hands shaking with anger and shame, and something else she couldn't name. Henry, I'm so sorry. They had no right. They had every right, Henry interrupted gently. They saw something they could mock, and they mocked it. That's what people do. But you didn't deserve. Deserves got nothing to do with it. He started walking again toward the house. Besides, they're not wrong. I can't ride. Never could, not properly. Too heavy for most horses, and the ones that can carry me. He shrugged. Well, I've never been able to afford them. Beatrice hurried to catch up, leading Sally and the wagon. Then how do you expect to work a ranch? Same way I've worked every job I've ever had. He glanced at her, and there was something almost amused in his expression. One step at a time. They reached the house as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. Henry set his bag on the porch and took in the property with a slow, considering gaze. The sagging barn door, the broken fence rails, the water trough that leaked from a crack in its side. Your letters mentioned 40 head of cattle, he said. Yes. And how much land is actually usable for grazing? About 200 acres. The rest is too rocky or the water access is poor. Henry nodded slowly, doing calculations in his head. That's workable. Tight, but workable. We'll need to rotate the grazing more carefully, fix the fences, maybe add another water source on the north section. We? Beatrice heard herself ask. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression made her throat tight. I came here to marry you, Miss Lane, to help you save this ranch. That hasn't changed just because some cowboys had a laugh at my expense. But they'll never stop. You saw Jake Morrison. That's how it'll be. Every time we go to town, every time someone sees you, they'll... Let them, Henry said simply. I didn't come here for their approval. I came here for you. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with a sincerity that made Beatrice want to cry. She had spent so long being practical, being tough, being the woman who could handle anything because she had no choice. And here was this man, this stranger she'd summoned via telegram, offering her something she'd almost forgotten existed, genuine kindness. I don't know what to say, she admitted. You don't have to say anything. Henry picked up his bag again. Just show me where I'm sleeping, and tomorrow we'll get to work. She showed him to the small room on the first floor that had been her father's study. It held a narrow bed, a desk, a chair, and not much else. Henry set his bag down and tested the bed with one hand. It groaned ominously. I'll sleep on the floor, he said immediately. Got blankets in my bag. I'm used to it. Henry, it's fine, Miss Lane. Really. He smiled at her, that gentle smile that seemed impossible given everything that had happened. I've slept in worse places. And please, get some rest. Tomorrow's a new day, and I promise you, I'm going to earn my keep. Beatrice retreated upstairs to her own room, exhausted beyond measure. She should have been planning the wedding, thinking about the ceremony at the church, the paperwork that would need filing. Instead, she lay in her bed and listened to the old house settle around her, and wondered what she had brought into her life. Below, she could hear Henry moving around, the gentle thump of him preparing his floor bed, and then, unexpectedly, the sound of humming. Low and tuneless, but somehow comforting, like a lullaby someone had forgotten the words to. She fell asleep to that sound and dreamed of letters written in careful script, of promises made on paper, of bridges that might hold or might collapse under the weight of what they carried. When she woke the next morning, dawn was just breaking, and from outside came the rhythmic sound of hammering. She dressed quickly and went to the window. Henry was in the yard already working on the fence. He'd stripped to his shirt sleeves despite the morning chill, and as she watched, he lifted a post that should have required 2 men to move, positioned it in its hole, and began packing earth around it with methodical precision. His movements were slow but steady, and there was something almost meditative about the way he worked. No wasted motion, no hurry, just consistent, persistent effort. By the time Beatrice had made coffee and breakfast, Henry had repaired 15 feet of fence line. She brought him coffee and biscuits, and he accepted them with genuine gratitude, sitting on a stump to eat while she stood awkwardly nearby. "You didn't have to start so early," she said. "Didn't want to waste the day." He bit into a biscuit, closed his eyes in appreciation. "These are excellent. They're just biscuits. They're better than anything I've made for myself in years." He opened his eyes, looked at her directly. "Miss Lane, Beatrice, I know yesterday was hard. I know this isn't what you expected when you sent those letters, but I meant what I said in my writing. I'm a man of my word. You give me a chance. Let me prove myself, and I swear I'll make this work." Beatrice found herself nodding, though she wasn't sure she believed him. Or rather, she wasn't sure she believed it was possible. The ranch needed so much work, and how could one man, even one as large as Henry, manage it all without being able to ride? But as the days passed, she began to see what he meant. Henry worked like a force of nature that refused to acknowledge its own limitations. By the end of the first week, he had repaired 30 yards of fence, rehung the barn door, patched the roof on the chicken coop, and constructed a new feed trough that sat level for the first time in 3 years. He did it all on foot, walking the property with a surveyor's eye, carrying tools and lumber that would have strained 2 normal men. Beatrice watched him from the kitchen window as she kneaded bread, trying to reconcile what she saw with what she'd expected. He moved slowly, yes, but he never stopped. From dawn until dusk, he was in motion, measuring, building, fixing, and always he was humming that tuneless melody that seemed to be his constant companion. On the 8th day, they went to town together for supplies. Beatrice had dreaded this trip since Henry's arrival, knowing what awaited them. She'd spent the morning choosing her words carefully, trying to find a way to suggest he stay at the ranch, but every phrasing sounded like what it was. Shame dressed up as practicality. In the end, Henry made the decision for her. "I'll need to see what Henderson's got in stock," he said over breakfast, "and we should probably talk to Reverend Walsh about the wedding ceremony. Unless you'd rather wait." The wedding? They'd been so busy with ranch work that Beatrice had almost forgotten they weren't actually married yet. Henry had never pushed, never mentioned it, simply worked and slept in his study and treated her with unfailing courtesy. But the bank wouldn't extend her credit much longer, not without a husband's name on the deed. "No," she said quietly. "We shouldn't wait." They took the wagon into Red Valley, Sally pulling while Henry walked alongside. He'd insisted, as always, claiming the wagon seat was more comfortable for her. Beatrice suspected he was just avoiding the inevitable complaints the wagon would make under his weight, but she didn't argue. The road was dry and dusty, the September heat still fierce despite the calendar creeping toward October. They passed the Morrison Ranch, and Beatrice tensed, but the brothers were nowhere to be seen. Henry noticed her reaction and smiled. "You're worried about them," he said. It wasn't a question. "They're mean drunks and bored besides. That's a dangerous combination. I've met worse." Henry picked up a stone from the road, examined it, tossed it aside. "Had a foreman once back in Ohio who used to whip the stable boys for sport. Said it kept them sharp. Jake Morrison's just a boy playing at being hard. A boy with a gun and brothers to back him up. Still just a boy. Henry glanced up at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her think he'd seen things she couldn't imagine. Real hard men don't need to prove it. They just are. They reached Red Valley just before noon when the sun was at its peak and the street was full of people. Beatrice felt their eyes immediately, the pause in conversation, the turned heads, the whispers that followed them like flies. Henry seemed oblivious, or perhaps just practiced at pretending to be. Henderson's general store was busy. Martha Henderson stood behind the counter, her daughter Emma restocking shelves. Both women's eyes went wide when Henry ducked through the doorway, his shoulders nearly brushing both sides of the frame. "Miss Lane," Martha said, her voice carefully neutral. "And this must be Mr. Dalton." "Ma'am." Henry removed his hat, held it against his chest. "Pleasure to meet you. Your husband wrote me about some fence posts he's got available." "Oh, yes." Martha seemed flustered by his politeness. "They're out back. Good cedar, just came in last week. Tom," she called toward the back room. "Tom, come help Mr. Dalton with those posts." Old Tom Henderson emerged, took one look at Henry, and his weathered face split into an expression of poorly concealed amazement. But he was from a generation that valued manners over entertainment, so he simply nodded and said, "Follow me, son." While Henry went to examine the posts, Beatrice gathered the other supplies they needed: flour, salt, coffee, a bolt of fabric for new curtains. Emma Henderson followed her around the store, clearly bursting with questions, but too well-bred to ask them directly. "Your husband seems very—" Emma began, then faltered. "Very polite?" "He is," Beatrice said shortly, measuring out flour. "And he's really going to work the ranch? Father says it's nearly impossible for one man, especially without—" Emma's cheeks colored. "Well, Father says it's a lot of work." "Henry's a hard worker." "I'm sure he is. I didn't mean—" Emma bit her lip. "It's just, people are talking, and I wanted you to know that not everyone thinks— some people are saying awful things, but Mother says you're doing what you have to do, and that's admirable." Beatrice set down the flour sack with more force than necessary. "Tell your mother I appreciate her understanding." Emma retreated, and Beatrice finished her shopping in silence, trying to ignore the way conversation died whenever she approached, the way it resumed in urgent whispers as soon as she passed. Henry returned with Tom Henderson, the old man shaking his head in amazement. "Never seen anyone carry 4 cedar posts at once," Tom said to his wife. "Just picked 'em up like they was kindling." "They're good posts," Henry said, apparently missing Tom's astonishment. "Fair price, too. We'll take a dozen if you've got them." "I've got 20 if you need them," Tom said. "Tell you what, I'll throw in an extra 2 for free. Any man who can carry 4 at once deserves a deal." It was kindly meant, but Beatrice saw how it landed. Henry's smile tightening just slightly, the way his shoulders tensed. He was being reduced to his size again, made into a curiosity, even if this time the attention was positive. "That's generous," Henry said quietly, "but we'll pay fair price for fair goods. That's how business should work." Tom blinked, nodded slowly. "As you like. I'll have my boy load them in your wagon." They left Henderson's and headed toward the church, where Reverend Walsh kept his office. The streets were fuller now, people emerging for lunch, and everywhere they went, the reaction was the same. Stares. Whispers. A few brave souls offering nods of greeting to Beatrice, while their eyes slid away from Henry like oil on water. And then they passed the saloon. Jake Morrison was there, of course, along with his brothers and half a dozen other ranch hands, drinking away their afternoon. Someone must have alerted them because they came spilling out onto the boardwalk just as Beatrice and Henry approached. "Well, well," Jake's voice was already slurred. "If it ain't the happy couple. Come to make it legal, Dalton? Gonna stand up in front of God and everybody and promise to love, honor, and not crush your bride to death?" His audience roared with laughter. Henry's hand found Beatrice's elbow, gently steering her to the far side of the street. "That's right. Waddle on by," Pete Morrison called out. "Ain't got time for real men, do you?" Henry kept walking, his face impassive. But Beatrice could feel the tension in his hand, the careful control it took to keep moving forward. "I'm talking to you, fat man." Jake had stepped off the boardwalk now, following them into the street. His brothers flanked him, emboldened by whiskey and an audience. The crowd that had been going about their business now stopped to watch, sensing entertainment. Henry stopped walking. He released Beatrice's elbow and turned, slowly, to face Jake Morrison. "I heard you," Henry said, his voice level. "But we have business with the Reverend, and you're drunk, so I'm going to ask you politely to let us pass." "You're going to ask?" Jake's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "You hear that, boys? He's going to ask." He stepped closer, and Beatrice could smell the whiskey on him from 5 feet away. "Here's the thing, Dalton. I don't much like being asked, especially not by a man who ain't really a man at all." "Jake, leave it alone," someone called from the saloon, one of the older hands, a man with some sense. "Reverend's watching from his window." "Let him watch." Jake turned back to Henry, his face flushed and mean. "Maybe the good Reverend needs to see what kind of freak Lane here is marrying. Maybe we all need to see if you can even fit through the church door." The crowd's laughter was nervous now, uncertain. This had gone past entertainment into something uglier. Beatrice stepped forward, but Henry's hand shot out, gently but firmly holding her back. "Mr. Morrison," Henry said, and his voice was so quiet it cut through the noise like a knife. "You're drunk, and you're scared, and you're trying to make yourself feel bigger by making me feel small. I understand that. But it's not going to work." Jake's face went dark red. "I ain't scared of nothing, especially not you." "You're scared you don't matter," Henry continued in that same quiet voice. "Scared that at the end of your life all you'll have to show for it is a talent for cruelty and a liver pickled in cheap whiskey. That's a legitimate fear, Mr. Morrison. You should probably do something about it." For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Jake's hand went to his gun, and Beatrice's heart stopped. But Henry didn't flinch. He just stood there, solid as a mountain, looking at Jake with something that might have been pity. "You gonna draw on an unarmed man?" Henry asked. "In front of the whole town? In front of the Reverend? Because that's the only way this ends with you feeling like a man, and I don't think you want to carry that weight." Jake's hand trembled on his gun. His brothers had gone quiet, suddenly sober enough to realize this had escalated beyond fun. The crowd watched in breathless silence. Then a new voice cut through the tension. "Jacob Morrison, you take your hand off that weapon this instant." Reverend Walsh stood on the church steps, his black coat flapping in the wind like the wings of an avenging angel. He was a small man, barely over 5 feet, but he had the presence of someone much larger. "This is the Lord's day, and you will not profane it with violence on my doorstep. Go home and sleep it off, or I will personally speak to your father about your behavior." The mention of his father, old Samuel Morrison, a devout man who ruled his sons with an iron fist, made Jake blanch. His hand dropped from his gun. "This ain't over," he muttered to Henry. "It never had to start," Henry replied. Jake and his brothers slunk back toward the saloon, and the crowd dispersed with the disappointed air of people denied their spectacle. Reverend Walsh descended the steps and approached them, his sharp eyes moving between Henry and Beatrice. "Miss Lane, Mr. Dalton, I presume." The Reverend offered his hand, which Henry shook carefully. "I apologize for that display. Some men never outgrow being boys." "No apology necessary, Reverend," Henry said. "We came to discuss a wedding, if you have time." Walsh's eyebrows rose slightly. Surprised, perhaps, that Henry wanted to proceed after what had just happened. "Of course, please, come inside." The Reverend's office was small and cluttered with books, a desk covered in papers, and 2 wooden chairs that looked like they'd survived the journey west by sheer stubbornness. Walsh cleared a space and gestured for them to sit. Henry eyed the chairs skeptically. "I'll stand if that's all right," he said. "As you wish." Walsh settled behind his desk, folded his hands. "Now then, Miss Lane, you sent word that you wish to marry, and Mr. Dalton, I received your letter as well. I must say this is rather unusual circumstances." "I need a husband to keep the ranch," Beatrice said bluntly. "The bank won't extend credit to an unmarried woman. Henry needs a home and work. It's practical." "Practical," Walsh repeated, tasting the word. "Marriage should be more than practical, Miss Lane. It's a sacred covenant before God." "I understand that, Reverend." "Do you?" Walsh's gaze was piercing. "Because what I just witnessed outside suggests your community doesn't understand. They see spectacle, mockery. A woman so desperate she'll marry anyone, and a man so— He paused, choosing his words carefully. So different that he stands out in ways that invite cruelty. Does that matter to God? Henry asked quietly. Walsh turned to him. What? You said marriage is a covenant before God. Does God care that I'm fat? That people laugh at me? That Jake Morrison thinks I'm not a real man? Henry's voice was steady, but Beatrice heard the steel underneath. Because if he does, then I need to find a different God. And if he doesn't, then what people think shouldn't matter to his reverend. A long silence filled the office. Walsh studied Henry with an expression Beatrice couldn't read, and she held her breath, certain they were about to be refused. Then Walsh laughed, a short, sharp sound of genuine amusement. Well said, Mr. Dalton. Well said indeed. He pulled a ledger from his desk drawer, opened it to a blank page. I'll marry you. Sunday next, after morning service. That gives you both a week to be certain this is what you want. Use that time wisely. They left the church together, and Beatrice felt something shift inside her. Not love. She barely knew Henry, but perhaps the first seed of respect. He had stood up to Jake Morrison without violence, answered the Reverend without apology, and done it all with a dignity that belied his size. Thank you, she said as they climbed into the wagon, for what you said back there, to Jake and to Reverend Walsh. Henry settled into his walking pace beside the wagon. I just told the truth. People either accept it or they don't. But at least I can sleep at night knowing I didn't lie about who I am. And who are you? He glanced up at her, and in the afternoon sunlight his eyes were warm. Still figuring that out, to be honest. But I know I'm not what Jake Morrison says I am. And I know I meant every word in those letters I sent you. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the town falling away behind them. As they passed the Morrison ranch, Beatrice tensed again, but the place looked quiet. Can I ask you something? Henry said. Of course. Why'd you really answer my letter? I mean, you had other responses. Why choose me? Beatrice considered lying or deflecting, but something about Henry's honesty demanded the same in return. You were the only one who seemed to want more than just a ranch or a warm bed. Your letters talked about books, about building something that would last, about partnership, Sheb. She paused. And you were honest about your limitations. The others pretended to be perfect. I'm far from perfect. I know, but at least you're honest about it. She smiled slightly. That matters more than I realized. They reached the ranch as the sun began its descent. Henry unloaded the supplies while Beatrice started dinner, and they fell into an easy routine that was beginning to feel almost natural. After the meal, Henry excused himself to work on the fence by lamplight, and Beatrice sat on the porch with her father's old account books, trying to make the numbers add up to something other than disaster. She was so absorbed in her calculations that she didn't notice when the humming stopped. Looking up, she saw Henry standing at the fence line, tools abandoned, staring out at the dark prairie with an expression she couldn't read. Henry? She walked over to him. Is something wrong? He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was distant. My father used to say I was a disappointment, said I'd never amount to anything because I was too fat to be useful, too slow to matter. He turned to her, and in the lamplight, his face looked older, sadder. I've spent my whole life trying to prove him wrong. But days like today, when men like Jake Morrison look at me and see nothing but a joke, it's hard not to wonder if my father was right. Beatrice's throat tightened. She'd spent so much time cataloging Henry's oddities, his limitations, that she'd never stopped to consider what it cost him to be looked at the way people looked at him. Your father was wrong, she said firmly. You've done more work in 8 days than most men do in a month. You stood up to Jake Morrison without throwing a punch. She struggled for words. You're here. Working. Trying. That's not nothing, Henry. That's everything. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's kind of you to say. It's not kind. It's true. She hesitated, then added, I was ashamed when you got off that train. I saw you and I felt embarrassed, and I'm sorry for that. I let other people's cruelty become my own, but you've never given me reason to be ashamed. You've only given me reasons to be grateful. Henry looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, the sadness lifting, replaced by something softer, more hopeful. Miss Lane, Beatrice, I know this isn't the marriage either of us dreamed of, but I promise you, I'm going to do everything I can to make it a good one. Not perfect, maybe, but good. Honest. Built on something real. I believe you, Beatrice said, and realized she meant it. The week passed in a blur of preparation. The house was cleaned until every surface gleamed. Beatrice sewed herself a new dress, nothing fancy, just clean calico and a soft green that made her dark hair look richer. Henry borrowed the wagon and made another trip to town, returning with lumber he claimed was for a project, though he wouldn't elaborate. The night before the wedding, Beatrice couldn't sleep. She stood at her bedroom window watching the stars wheel overhead, thinking about the enormity of what she was about to do. Tomorrow, she would stand before the community that had mocked them both and pledge her life to a man she'd known for 2 weeks. Below, she heard Henry moving around, and then, unexpectedly, the sound of the front door opening. Curious, she pulled on her robe and crept downstairs. Henry was outside, sitting on the porch steps, looking up at the same stars. He'd stripped to his shirt sleeves despite the October chill, and in the moonlight he looked almost ethereal. A mountain made human, or perhaps a human becoming something larger. "Can't sleep?" Beatrice asked from the doorway. He startled slightly, then smiled. "Nervous, I guess. Tomorrow's a big day. Are you having second thoughts?" "No." His answer was immediate, certain. "Are you?" Beatrice sat down beside him on the steps, pulling her robe tighter against the cold. "I don't know. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be thinking." "That makes 2 of us." Henry was quiet for a moment, then said, "I want you to know something, Beatrice. I know you don't love me. I don't expect you to, but I need you to know that I'm going to spend every day trying to be worthy of the chance you're giving me. Not because I want you to fall in love with me, though I wouldn't object if you did, but because it's the right thing to do. Because you deserve someone who tries." Tears pricked Beatrice's eyes, though she couldn't have said exactly why. "I'll try too," she whispered. "To be a good wife. To build something with you that's worth the work." They sat together in the darkness, 2 people on the edge of something neither quite understood, and overhead the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent and eternal. Sunday morning dawned cold and clear. Beatrice dressed carefully in her new green dress, braided her hair and wound it in a crown around her head, and tried to calm the butterflies in her stomach. When she came downstairs, Henry was already in his best clothes, a suit that looked painfully small on him, the jacket straining across his shoulders, but clean and pressed nonetheless. "You look beautiful," he said, and the simple honesty of it made Beatrice's breath catch. "You look—" She searched for the right word. "Ready." They took the wagon to town, arriving just as the church bells began to ring. The building was fuller than Beatrice had expected. Curiosity, she suspected, more than goodwill. People wanted to see the spectacle of Beatrice Lane marrying her mail-order giant. Let them look, she thought with sudden defiance. Let them see. Reverend Walsh met them at the altar, his expression solemn. The ceremony was simple, the words ancient and heavy with meaning. When it came time to exchange vows, Henry's voice was steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the sanctuary. "I, Henry Dalton, take you, Beatrice Lane, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to work beside you, to honor your strength, to build with you a life worth living. I promise to always get there, no matter how long the walk." Beatrice's own vows caught in her throat, but she forced them out. "I, Beatrice Lane, take you, Henry Dalton, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to see you for who you are, not who others say you should be. I promise to build with you, to trust in your word, and to give you the home you deserve." The Reverend pronounced them married, and Henry kissed her, gentle, brief, almost shy. The congregation applauded, and if some of the clapping was half-hearted or mocking, Beatrice chose not to notice. They signed the register, accepted awkward congratulations from neighbors, and escaped as quickly as propriety allowed. On the ride home, Beatrice expected to feel different, transformed somehow by the ceremony. But she felt only tired and uncertain and oddly grateful for the solid presence of Henry walking beside the wagon. "Well," Henry said as the ranch came into view, "we did it. We did. And now the real work begins." Beatrice looked at him, at this man who was now her husband, and felt something settle in her chest. Not love, not yet, but perhaps the foundation on which love could be built: respect, honesty, and the shared determination to make something good from the materials they'd been given. "Then we'd better get started," she said. Henry smiled, that gentle smile that seemed to be his natural state, and together they came home to begin building their life, one careful step at a time, while the autumn wind whispered promises neither quite believed, but both desperately wanted to be true. The first month of marriage passed in a rhythm of work that left little time for the awkwardness of intimacy. Henry slept in his study, Beatrice in her room upstairs, and between them stretched a distance that was both comfortable and strange. They were partners in survival, bound by legal contract and shared necessity, learning each other's habits the way one learns the quirks of a new tool. Henry rose before dawn each morning, and Beatrice would wake to the sound of him moving through the house, careful to be quiet, but unable to disguise his size. The floorboards creaked under his weight like the deck of a ship in heavy seas. By the time she came downstairs, he'd already have the fire going, coffee brewing, and would be halfway through whatever project he'd assigned himself for the day. He was building something behind the barn, working on it in spare moments when the light was good. Beatrice had asked about it once, and he'd smiled that mysterious smile and said, "You'll see when it's done." She'd learned not to push. Henry revealed himself slowly, like a book written in a language she was still learning to read. October deepened into November and the work intensified. The cattle needed to be moved to winter pasture. The barn needed weatherproofing before the snows came, and a dozen other tasks demanded attention. Henry approached each one with the same methodical determination, breaking large problems into small steps, accomplishing through persistence what he couldn't achieve through speed. The ranch hands from neighboring properties would sometimes ride past and watch him work, their expressions ranging from amazement to contempt. Henry ignored them all equally. Beatrice found herself defending him in town when she went for supplies, her initial shame transforming into something fiercer. "I don't care what he looks like," she'd snapped at Martha Henderson when the woman had made a pitying comment. "He works harder than any 3 men I've known, and he's twice as honest. That's what matters on a ranch." Martha had raised her eyebrows but said nothing more, and word must have spread because the comments became less frequent, though the stares never stopped. It was mid-November when the trouble started in earnest. Beatrice was in the kitchen preserving the last of the garden vegetables when Henry came in from the north pasture, his face grim. "We've got fence down," he said without preamble. 30 yards, maybe more. Cut clean through with wire cutters." Beatrice set down her knife. "Someone cut our fence?" "And drove about 20 head of cattle through the gap. Tracks lead east toward Morrison land." The implication hung in the air between them. Jake Morrison, making good on his threat. Beatrice felt rage bloom hot in her chest, but Henry's expression remained carefully neutral. "We should report it to the sheriff," Beatrice said. "Sheriff's brother-in-law to Samuel Morrison. You think he'll take our word over Jake's?" Henry pulled off his hat, ran a hand through his hair. "No. We fix the fence, count our losses, and keep our eyes open." "That's not justice." "No," Henry agreed quietly, "but it's practical. We can't afford to make enemies of the Morrisons, not when we're barely holding on as it is. We fix what's broken, and we move forward." Beatrice wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. The balance of power in Red Valley had nothing to do with justice, and everything to do with who had the most land, the most men, the most guns. The Lane Ranch had none of those things. They spent the next 2 days repairing the fence, Henry digging post holes while Beatrice stretched wire. It was brutal work, made worse by the November cold that had settled over the territory like a punishment. Beatrice's hands blistered and bled, but she refused to stop. This was her land, her ranch, and she'd be damned if Jake Morrison would take it from her through casual cruelty. On the 3rd day, as they were finishing the repairs, riders appeared on the horizon. 3 of them, silhouetted against the pale sky. Beatrice felt her stomach clench, but Henry simply set down his tools and stood waiting, solid as the fence post he'd been planting. The Morrison brothers rode up slowly, taking their time, making a show of their presence. Jake sat in the middle, his face split by that mean grin Beatrice had come to hate. "Heard you had some fence trouble," Jake called out, not bothering to dismount. "Shame about that. And losing cattle too?" Bad luck seems to follow you two around. Luck's got nothing to do with it, Beatrice said coldly. Someone cut that fence deliberately. You making an accusation, Mrs. Dalton? Jake's grin widened. Because that's a serious thing. Accusing a neighbor of theft. Might want to be careful unless you got proof. We've got tracks leading straight to your property. Montana's open range, darling. Cattle wander. Tracks don't mean nothing. He shifted in his saddle, his attention moving to Henry. How about you, fat man? You got something to say? Henry's expression didn't change. I've got plenty to say. Question is whether you're sober enough to understand it. Jake's grin faltered. You calling me a drunk? I'm saying you rode onto my property to gloat about damage you most likely caused. That suggests either drunkenness or stupidity, and I'm trying to be charitable. Pete Morrison laughed. A short, surprised bark. He's got you there, Jake. Jake's face flushed dark red. You got a smart mouth for a man who can't even climb on a horse. Maybe someone should teach you some manners. Maybe someone should try, Henry said quietly, but you'd have to get off that horse first, and we both know you won't. The tension ratcheted up like a tightening wire. Tom Morrison's hand drifted toward his gun, and Beatrice felt fear spike through her anger. But Henry didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there watching Jake with those steady brown eyes. You ain't worth my time, Jake finally spat. He yanked his horse's head around viciously. But your fence is going to keep having problems, Dalton. Funny thing about fences, they break, regular-like. Maybe you should consider selling out before something worse than fence posts gets broken. They rode off, leaving nothing but dust and the echo of threat hanging in the cold air. Beatrice found her hands were shaking. He's going to keep doing this, she said. Cutting fences, stealing cattle, making our lives hell until we give up and sell. Probably. Henry picked up his tools, went back to work. So we don't give up. Henry, I know it's hard, Beatrice, believe me. I know. But men like Jake Morrison want you to fight back because that gives them an excuse to escalate. They want you angry and reckless so they can claim self-defense when they hurt you. He tamped dirt around a post with methodical precision. We're not going to give them that. We're going to fix what they break, protect what we can, and outlast them. And if they escalate anyway? Henry was quiet for a long moment. Then we deal with that when it comes. But we don't start that fight. We end it. There was something in his voice that made Beatrice look at him more closely. Beneath the gentle exterior, beneath the patience and the humming and the slow, careful movements, there was something harder, something that had been forged in circumstances she didn't know and couldn't imagine. Who were you before you came here? She asked suddenly. I mean, really. You told me about your family's farm, about heading west, but there's something you're not saying. I can feel it. Henry's hand stilled on the post. For a moment, Beatrice thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. I was a soldier, he said quietly. Briefly, when I was 19, got conscripted for a skirmish with native tribes up in Minnesota. I was big even then, and they figured I could carry supplies if nothing else. He resumed working, but his movements were mechanical now, his mind clearly elsewhere. I saw things in that war, terrible things, things that made me understand that violence is easy and cruelty is cheaper than kindness, and I decided I never wanted to be the kind of man who chose the easy path. Jake Morrison is choosing the easy path. He is, and eventually that path leads somewhere dark. Might take him years to get there, but he will. Henry straightened, looked at her directly. I'm not afraid of Jake Morrison, Beatrice. I'm afraid of what I might become if I let his cruelty make me cruel. So I choose patience. I choose the long road. And I choose to believe that eventually doing the right thing matters. Beatrice felt something shift in her understanding of this man she'd married. He wasn't passive. He wasn't weak. He was perhaps the strongest person she'd ever met. But his strength was the kind that bent rather than broke, that absorbed rather than reflected. I think, she said slowly, that you might be the best man I've ever known. Henry's smile was sad and sweet. That's kind of you. But we both know I'm just stubborn. The harassment continued. Twice more they found fences cut, though never when they could prove who'd done it. Once they discovered their water trough had been poisoned, Henry had to spend 2 days digging a new well. The general store's prices seemed to rise whenever Beatrice came to shop, and at church, families who'd been friendly began finding excuses to avoid conversation. The Morrisons had power in Red Valley, and they were using it to isolate the Daltons, to make clear that there was a price for refusing to be intimidated. Beatrice felt it like a noose tightening around them, cutting off air and options equally. But Henry kept working. He finished his mysterious project behind the barn, and when he showed it to Beatrice, she found herself speechless. He'd built a cart, not a wagon, but something more elegant. It was designed to be pulled by a single horse, with a seat wide enough for his frame and sturdy wheels that could handle rough terrain. Most ingeniously, it had a series of racks and holders built into the sides for tools, rope, supplies. "This way I can cover the property without riding," Henry explained, running his hand along the cart's smooth wood with obvious pride. "Won't be fast, but it'll let me do what needs doing." "Henry, this is—" Beatrice struggled for words. "This is brilliant." "It's practical," he corrected, but she could see the pleasure in his eyes. "Just like everything else. If you can't do something one way, you find another." He began using the cart the next day, and it transformed his efficiency. He could haul tools and materials, check fence lines, even transport hay to the winter pasture. Cowboys from neighboring ranches would stop and stare at the strange sight. This massive man in his ingenious cart, moving slowly but steadily across the landscape, but Henry ignored them all. December came in with bitter cold and the promise of snow. Beatrice woke one morning to find the world transformed, white and silent under the season's first real storm. She came downstairs to find Henry already dressed for the weather, layers of wool and canvas that made him look even larger. "Cattle need checking," he said, downing the coffee she'd poured for him. "Weather like this, they might have drifted. I'll come with you." "No need. You stay warm. I'll be back by dark." But Beatrice was already reaching for her coat. "We're partners, remember? You don't get to protect me from the hard work." Something in Henry's expression softened. "Fair enough. But wear extra socks. Your feet are going to freeze in this." They took the cart out together, Sally pulling gamely through snow that was already ankle-deep and still falling. The world had contracted to a sphere of white, visibility limited to a few dozen yards. Beatrice could feel the cold seeping through her layers, her breath frosting in the air, but Henry seemed unbothered, humming that tuneless melody as he guided Sally along fence lines. They found the first group of cattle huddled in a coulee on the north section, the animals pressed together for warmth. Henry counted them methodically, compared the number to his mental inventory, and nodded. "All here. They've got sense enough to find shelter." He urged Sally onward. "Let's check the west pasture." But as they crested a rise, the wind suddenly intensified, transforming from a steady cold to a howling fury. The snow, which had been falling straight down, now flew horizontal, stinging their faces like thrown sand. Sally whinnied nervously, tossing her head. "We should head back," Beatrice shouted over the wind. Henry nodded, turning the cart. But the world had become a whiteout, every direction looking identical, the landscape erased by wind and snow. Sally took a few steps, then stopped, confused about which way led home. "Henry?" Beatrice's voice was tight with fear she was trying to hide. "It's all right." Henry's calm seemed unshakable even now. "We just need to orient ourselves." He looked around, trying to find landmarks that had been obliterated by the storm. "The wind's coming from the north, so if we keep it on our left, we'll be heading roughly east, back toward the ranch." They tried to move forward, but the snow was deepening rapidly, Sally struggling to pull the cart through drifts that were now knee-high on the horse. Progress slowed to a crawl, then stopped entirely when the cart's wheel caught on something hidden beneath the snow, a rock or a root, and stuck fast. Henry climbed down, sank into snow up to his waist. He tried to free the wheel, his breath coming in great clouds, but it wouldn't budge. The cold was becoming dangerous now, the kind of cold that killed quickly and without mercy. "We can't stay here," Beatrice said, her teeth starting to chatter. "I know." Henry's face was grim. He unhitched Sally from the cart, then turned to Beatrice. "Can you ride? Bareback in this weather? I'll fall off." "Not if I'm holding you." Before Beatrice could protest, Henry had lifted her onto Sally's back, his strength making the maneuver look effortless despite the snow and wind. He climbed up behind her. Sally staggered under the combined weight but held, and wrapped his arms around Beatrice, holding the reins on either side of her. "I'm too heavy for her," he said into Beatrice's ear, his breath warm against her frozen skin. "But Sally's strong, and it's not far. She can make it if we trust her." He gave Sally her head, letting the horse choose the path, trusting her instincts to find home. The animal moved carefully, testing each step, her ears swiveling as she tried to navigate through the whiteout. Henry's bulk behind Beatrice blocked the worst of the wind, and despite the danger, despite the cold, she felt oddly safe wrapped in his arms. Time became meaningless. They might have been traveling for minutes or hours. Beatrice couldn't tell. Her feet had gone numb, her hands useless claws clutching Sally's mane. She could feel Henry shivering behind her, great tremors that ran through his frame, but his arms never loosened their careful hold. "Stay awake," he murmured when her head started to droop. "Talk to me. Tell me about something. Anything." "Like what?" Her words were slurred with cold. "Tell me about your father. You've never really talked about him." So Beatrice talked, her voice barely audible over the wind, telling Henry about Daniel Lane, who'd carved a ranch from raw prairie through sheer stubbornness, how he'd taught her to ride before she could properly walk, how he'd treated her like a son because she was all he had, how he'd made her promise on his deathbed to keep the ranch alive no matter what. "He would have liked you," she said, surprised to realize it was true. "He respected hard work more than anything, and you're the hardest worker I've ever seen." "I'm just," Henry began, but Sally suddenly stopped, her head raised. Then she nickered, a sound of recognition, and started moving faster. They'd found the ranch, the buildings materialized out of the snow like miracles, solid and real. Sally carried them straight to the barn, and Henry slid down, then lifted Beatrice off the horse's back. Her legs wouldn't hold her. They'd been locked in position for too long, and she collapsed into his arms. "I've got you," Henry said, and carried her into the house. He set her by the fire he'd banked that morning, then went back for Sally, getting the horse settled and fed before seeing to his own needs. When he finally came back inside, his face was gray with cold, his hand shaking so badly he couldn't work the buttons on his coat. Beatrice forced her own frozen fingers to help him, peeling off layers of wet wool and canvas until Henry stood in his undershirt, his skin mottled with cold. She made hot coffee, added whiskey from the bottle her father had kept for medicinal purposes, and they sat by the fire drinking it while feelings slowly returned to their extremities in waves of painful pins and needles. "That was close," Beatrice finally said. "Too close." Henry stared into his coffee cup. "I should have checked the weather better. Should have known a storm was coming. I put you in danger because I was stubborn about checking those cattle." "We both went. We both chose." Beatrice set down her cup, reached out and touched his hand. It was the first time she'd initiated physical contact since their wedding kiss. "Henry, you kept us alive out there. You stayed calm, you made the right choices, and you kept me warm when I would have frozen. You didn't put me in danger. You saved me from it." Henry looked at their joined hands, his expression unreadable. "I was terrified," he admitted quietly. "The whole time I was thinking about how, if something happened to you, it would be my fault. How you'd trusted me, and I'd failed you. But you didn't fail me. We're here, we're safe. This time," Henry's jaw tightened. "But what about next time? What if the Morrisons' harassment escalates beyond property damage? What if—" "Then we'll face it together," Beatrice interrupted firmly. "Like we faced that storm. One step at a time, Henry. That's what you taught me. You don't have to see the whole path. You just have to take the next step." He smiled then, and there was something new in his expression. Not just gratitude or relief, but something warmer, more personal. "You were listening." "I'm always listening, even when I'm pretending not to." She hesitated, then added, "You're a good man, Henry Dalton. I'm grateful you answered my advertisement. I'm grateful you're here." "So am I," he said softly. "More grateful than you know." They sat together by the fire as the storm raged outside. Two people slowly learning what it meant to be partners in more than just name, building something between them that was fragile but real, a foundation laid one careful brick at a time. The storm lasted 3 days, trapping them in the house together. They passed the time working on indoor tasks, Beatrice sewing, Henry repairing tools and equipment. They talked more in those 3 days than they had in the entire 2 months previous, filling the silence with stories of their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Beatrice learned that Henry had once wanted to be a teacher, but his size had made parents uncomfortable. Henry learned that Beatrice had secretly wanted to see the ocean, though she'd never told her father because she knew he'd see it as a betrayal of the ranch. On the third night, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Henry said suddenly, "I'm falling in love with you." Beatrice's needle stilled mid-stitch. Her heart was pounding, though she couldn't have said if it was from fear or something else. "I know you don't feel the same," Henry continued, his eyes on the fire. "And that's all right. I'm not telling you because I expect anything. I'm telling you because it's true, and I don't want to carry it around like a secret. You deserve to know." Beatrice set down her sewing, her mind racing. Love. She'd stopped believing in that particular fairy tale somewhere between her father's death and the bank's ultimatum. Love was for people with choices, with options, with the luxury of romance. She and Henry had married for survival, for practicality, for the simple need to keep living. But sitting there, looking at this man who'd walked through a blizzard carrying her, who defended her without violence, who built things with his hands and hummed while he worked, Beatrice realized she'd been lying to herself. "I don't know if what I feel is love," she said slowly. "I don't know if I even remember what love is supposed to feel like, but I know that I trust you more than I've trusted anyone. I know that I think about you when you're not around. I know that when that storm hit, I wasn't afraid because you were with me." She met his eyes. "Maybe that's not love, but maybe it's the beginning of something that could become love, if we let it." Henry's smile was like sunrise, slow and warm and illuminating. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." And when Beatrice crossed the room to sit beside him on the floor by the fire, when she leaned her head against his shoulder and felt his arm come around her, careful and gentle, it felt like coming home in a way that had nothing to do with buildings or land or any of the practical concerns that had brought them together. It felt like finding something she hadn't known she'd been looking for. Outside, the storm finally broke, and stars emerged one by one in the Montana sky, cold and distant and beautiful. Inside, two people sat by firelight, building something fragile and precious, not perfect, but real, and growing stronger with each passing moment, one careful choice at a time. The winter deepened, each week bringing new challenges and new intimacies. Henry moved his things upstairs to Beatrice's room, though they maintained a careful physical distance, both of them navigating the strange territory between partnership and something more profound. They shared a bed but kept to their respective sides, and Beatrice found comfort in the sound of his breathing in the darkness, the warmth of another person nearby after so many months of sleeping alone. Christmas came quietly. They had no money for gifts, but Henry carved her a small wooden box with her initials worked into the lid, the craftsmanship so fine it looked like the work of a professional. Beatrice gave him a shirt she'd sewn from fabric she'd been saving, cut large enough to fit his frame without straining at the seams. They exchanged these tokens on Christmas morning with a shyness that felt absurd given they'd been married for months, but also sweet in its awkwardness. "It's perfect," Henry said, holding up the shirt with genuine wonder. "I've never had anything that fit properly." "Try it on," Beatrice urged, and when he did, when she saw how it draped correctly across his shoulders without pulling or gaping, she felt an unexpected surge of pride. This was what love looked like, she thought. Not grand gestures or passionate declarations, but learning the exact measurements of another person's body so you could clothe them properly against the cold. January brought hardship. The cattle, stressed by the harsh winter, began to sicken. Henry spent hours in the freezing cold tending to them, dosing them with remedies, moving the weakest ones closer to the barn where they'd have better shelter. 3 calves died despite his efforts, and Beatrice found him one evening sitting in the barn, his shoulders slumped, looking defeated in a way she'd never seen. "It's not your fault," she said, sitting beside him on a hay bale. "I know. Doesn't make it easier." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Your father built this place from nothing, and I'm watching it die by inches." "You're keeping it alive," Beatrice corrected firmly. "Every day you're out here working, every fence you fix, every animal you save, you're keeping his dream alive. He would see that, Henry. He would be grateful. Would he? Henry's voice was raw. Or would he see what everyone else sees? A man too fat to ride, too slow to matter, playing at being a rancher. Beatrice grabbed his face between her cold hands, forcing him to look at her. Listen to me. You are twice the man Jake Morrison will ever be. You're twice the man most men in this territory are. And I'll be damned if I let you sit here and believe the lies cruel people tell about you. Something in Henry's eyes shifted, vulnerability giving way to something harder, more determined. You really believe that? I wouldn't say it if I didn't. He kissed her then, properly, deeply, and Beatrice kissed him back with all the confused tangle of emotions she'd been carrying, gratitude and respect, and the tentative beginning of something that felt dangerously close to love. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Henry rested his forehead against hers. I don't deserve you, he murmured. Good thing it's not about deserving then. It's about choosing. And I choose you, Henry Dalton. Every day, I choose you. That night, their marriage became complete in the way it hadn't been before. Two people reaching for each other in the darkness, learning the geography of each other's bodies with careful tenderness. Afterward, as Beatrice lay with her head on Henry's chest, listening to his heart slow from its racing, she felt something inside her chest expand and settle, as though a piece she hadn't known was missing had finally clicked into place. February brought a brief thaw, and with it, hope. The surviving cattle rallied. The snow melted enough that Henry could check fence lines more easily. The bank, presented with deed papers showing Henry's name beside Beatrice's, agreed to extend their credit for seed and supplies. Things were still tight, still precarious, but for the first time since her father's death, Beatrice felt like they might actually survive. And then Jake Morrison made his move. It happened on a gray afternoon in late February. Beatrice had gone to town alone for supplies, leaving Henry to work on the barn roof. She was loading flour sacks into the wagon when Jake appeared, stepping out from the alley beside Henderson's store. He was alone this time, and there was something different about him, a focused intensity that was somehow more frightening than his usual drunken aggression. Mrs. Dalton, he said, his voice carefully polite. Got a minute to talk? I don't think we have anything to discuss. See, that's where you're wrong. Jake moved closer, not threatening but deliberate, backing her against the wagon. I think we got plenty to discuss, like how long you plan to keep pretending that joke of a marriage is real. My marriage is none of your business. It is when it's keeping you on land that should be mine. Jake's smile was cold. See, my daddy's been wanting to expand east for years. Your little ranch sits right where he needs to build. We made your father a fair offer before he died, but stubborn bastard wouldn't sell. Thought maybe you'd be smarter. I'm not selling. Even if I make it worth your while? Jake pulled a folded paper from his pocket. I got a bank draft here for twice what that property's worth. Enough money to set you and your fat husband up somewhere else. Somewhere people won't laugh at him every time he shows his face. Somewhere you won't have to be embarrassed to be seen with him. The words landed like physical blows. Beatrice felt her face heat, shame and anger mixing toxic in her chest. But beneath it all was something colder, something calculating. Let me see that draft, she said. Jake's eyes lit up with triumph. He handed over the paper and Beatrice examined it carefully. It was real, made out for an amount that would indeed set them up comfortably elsewhere. For a moment, she let herself imagine it, leaving Red Valley, leaving the harassment and the struggle, starting fresh somewhere Henry wouldn't be constantly mocked. Then she tore the draft in half. Get away from me, Jake, and don't come near me or my husband again. Jake's expression went dark. You're making a mistake. The only mistake I made was not telling you to go to hell months ago. Now move. But Jake didn't move. Instead, he leaned in close, his breath hot on her face. You think you're safe because you married that freak? You think he can protect you? He can't even protect himself. And one of these days, you're going to wake up and find him hurt real bad, and you're going to remember this conversation and wish you'd been smart. Is that a threat? It's a fact. Things happen to people who don't know when to quit. Fences get cut. Cattle go missing. Barns catch fire. Jake straightened, his smile returning. It'd be a shame if your barn burned down with all those animals inside. Be a real shame. Before Beatrice could respond, a shadow fell over them both. She looked up to see Tom Henderson standing in the doorway of his store, a rifle cradled casually in his arms. "Problem here, Mrs. Dalton?" the old man asked, his voice mild but his eyes hard. Jake took a step back. "No problem, just having a neighborly conversation. Looked like harassment to me, and I don't tolerate harassment outside my store." Tom's grip on the rifle tightened slightly. "I think you should move along now, Jake. And if I see you bothering Mrs. Dalton again, I'll be having a conversation with your daddy. We clear?" For a moment, Jake looked like he might argue. Then he spat in the dust and stalked away, his shoulders tight with anger. Tom waited until he'd rounded the corner before lowering the rifle. "You all right, ma'am?" Beatrice realized she was shaking. "Yes. Thank you, Mr. Henderson." "That boy's nothing but trouble." Tom's expression was troubled. "His daddy can't control him anymore, and he's getting bolder. You and your husband need to be careful." "We will be." But as Beatrice drove home, Jake's words echoed in her mind. Barns catch fire. It wasn't subtle, it was a clear threat, a promise of violence to come. And she knew, with sick certainty, that Jake Morrison was done playing games. She found Henry exactly where she'd left him, working on the barn roof. He climbed down when he saw her face, immediately concerned. "What happened?" Beatrice told him everything. The confrontation, the draft, the threats. Henry's expression went carefully blank, that dangerous stillness settling over him that she'd only seen a handful of times. "He threatened to burn the barn," Henry said quietly, "with the animals inside." "Yes." "Then we need to be ready." Henry looked at the barn, his mind clearly working through scenarios. "I'll sleep out here for a while. Keep watch." "Henry, you can't stay awake every night. I'll do what I need to do to protect what's ours." His voice was firm. "Jake Morrison thinks I'm weak because I won't fight him on his terms. But protecting you, protecting this place, that's not weakness. That's the only thing that matters." That night, Henry made a bedroll in the barn loft where he could watch both doors. Beatrice brought him dinner and extra blankets, hating the necessity of it, but knowing he was right. Jake had escalated beyond harassment into outright threats, and they couldn't afford to be unprepared. "I wish you'd let me stay with you," she said. "I need you in the house, keeping watch there. If someone comes for the barn, they might try for the house too." Henry pulled her close, kissed her forehead. "This won't be forever, just until we figure out what to do." "What can we do?" "The sheriff won't help us. Nobody in town will stand against the Morrisons." Tom Henderson did today. One old man with a rifle. One old man is a start. Henry smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "And we're not helpless, Beatrice. We're just outnumbered. There's a difference." For 3 nights, nothing happened. Henry kept his vigil in the barn while Beatrice lay awake in their bed, listening to every creak and groan of the house, jumping at shadows. During the day, they worked together, never letting the ranch out of their sight, taking turns on watch. The tension was exhausting, grinding them down by degrees. Beatrice could see it in the lines around Henry's eyes, the way his humming had stopped, the way he moved with constant vigilance instead of his usual relaxed grace. On the 4th night, the attack came. Beatrice woke to the smell of smoke. She was out of bed and running before she'd fully processed the thought, grabbing her robe and racing down the stairs. Through the kitchen window, she could see flames, not the barn, but the chicken coop, the small structure already half engulfed in fire. She ran outside, screaming Henry's name. He appeared from the barn like a ghost, moving faster than she'd ever seen him move despite his size. He had a bucket in each hand, and he was already running for the water trough. "Get more buckets," he shouted, "and wet down the barn walls. If the wind shifts, the whole thing could catch." They fought the fire together, a desperate battle against flames that seemed determined to spread. Henry threw bucket after bucket of water on the burning coop while Beatrice soaked the barn walls, both of them coughing in the thick smoke. The chickens they'd managed to free scattered across the yard, their panicked clucking adding to the chaos. By the time they got the fire under control, the chicken coop was a blackened skeleton, still smoking in the pre-dawn darkness. Both of them were filthy with soot and ash, their hands blistered, their lungs raw from smoke. Henry stood staring at the ruins, his chest heaving. "It was set deliberately," he said, his voice rough. "I can smell the kerosene." "Did you see who did it?" "No, I was watching the barn doors. Whoever did this came from the west, knew exactly where I'd be looking." Henry's hands clenched into fists. They're toying with us, showing us they can strike whenever they want. Beatrice felt something break inside her, the last vestige of hope that this could end peacefully, that they could simply outlast the Morrisons' cruelty. Jake wasn't going to stop. He was going to keep escalating until they either sold or someone got hurt. Or worse. "We need help," she said. "We can't do this alone." "Who's going to help us? Everyone in Red Valley is either too scared of the Morrisons or too entertained by watching us struggle." Tom Henderson helped. "One old man is a start," Beatrice interrupted, throwing his own words back at him. "You said it yourself, and maybe there are others. Maybe people are just waiting for someone to stand up first. Maybe we need to be the ones to start standing." Henry looked at her for a long moment, and she saw exhaustion and determination warring in his expression. "All right," he finally said. "We stand, but we do it smart. We document everything. We gather evidence, and we make it impossible for the sheriff to ignore us." They spent the rest of the night cleaning up the damage and tending to the frightened animals. At dawn, before going to bed for a few hours of desperately needed sleep, Henry walked the property and found what he was looking for: boot prints in the soft earth near the coop and a discarded kerosene can half hidden in the brush. He brought both to the house and carefully documented them in the ranch ledger, noting the date, time, and exact location of each piece of evidence. "We're building a case," he told Beatrice. "Every incident, every threat, everything gets written down. Eventually, we'll have enough that even a corrupt sheriff can't ignore it." But that afternoon, as Henry slept and Beatrice sat at the kitchen table trying to make sense of their finances, a horse and rider appeared on the road. It wasn't Jake Morrison or his brothers. It was Samuel Morrison himself, the patriarch of the family, a man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes like chips of granite. Beatrice met him on the porch, her heart hammering. Samuel Morrison was known throughout the territory as a hard man but a fair one, a cattleman of the old school who valued honor and kept his word. If anyone could control Jake, it was his father. "Mrs. Dalton," Samuel said, removing his hat. His voice was gravel and whiskey, the product of decades of shouting orders across open range. "I heard about your chicken coop, came to offer my apologies and my assistance." Beatrice blinked, momentarily speechless. "Your apologies?" "My son Jake has been making trouble. I've known it for a while, but I didn't realize how serious it had become until Tom Henderson paid me a visit this morning. Told me about the threats, the harassment." Samuel's expression was grim. "That's not how I raised my boys, and it's not how Morrisons conduct themselves. Do you know if he was involved in the fire?" "I know he came home at 3 in the morning smelling of smoke and kerosene. When I confronted him, he tried to lie, but he's never been good at it." Samuel's jaw tightened. "I've sent him to stay with my brother in Wyoming for the rest of the winter, minimum, maybe longer if he doesn't learn to control himself." Relief flooded through Beatrice so powerfully it made her lightheaded. "Thank you. You don't know what that means to us." "I should have stepped in sooner. Truth is, I thought it was just boys being boys, rivalry over you. I didn't realize it had gotten mean." Samuel shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "I also wanted to say, your husband. I've watched him working your place these past months, seen him in that cart of his, seen how he never quits no matter how hard the task. That's the kind of man this territory needs, the kind who builds instead of tears down." Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes. "Most people don't see it that way." "Most people are fools." Samuel's smile was brief but genuine. "My offer to buy your land still stands if you ever want to sell, but it's a fair offer, Mrs. Dalton. No threats, no harassment. And in the meantime, if you need anything, supplies, assistance, another set of hands during calving season, you let me know. The Morrisons owe you a debt, and we pay our debts." He rode away, leaving Beatrice standing on the porch in a state of shock. When Henry woke an hour later and she told him what had happened, he was equally stunned. Samuel Morrison apologized? And sent Jake away. "Well," Henry sat down heavily at the kitchen table processing this information. "Well, I didn't see that coming." "Neither did I." Beatrice found herself laughing, slightly hysterical with relief. "We're not fighting the Morrisons anymore. We might actually have their support." "Don't go that far," Henry cautioned, but he was smiling. But at least we're not fighting. That's more than I hoped for. The rest of the winter passed in relative peace. Without Jake Morrison's constant harassment, the ranch work became merely difficult instead of impossible. Samuel Morrison, true to his word, sent over 2 of his hands to help with calving season, and the gesture was noted by others in the community. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, attitudes began to shift. At church, families stopped avoiding them. At Henderson's store, Martha started offering them the same prices she charged everyone else. Cowboys who'd once laughed at Henry's cart now nodded respectfully when they passed him on the road. It wasn't acceptance exactly, but it was something close to tolerance, and after months of open hostility, tolerance felt like victory. March brought the first hints of spring, and with it, a sense of possibility. The ranch had survived the winter. They had survived. Beatrice stood on the porch one evening watching Henry work on a new chicken coop to replace the one that had burned, and felt something fierce and protective bloom in her chest. "You know I love you, right?" she called out to him. Henry looked up from his hammering, surprise and joy warring on his face. "Say that again?" "I love you." The words came easier the second time, feeling true and right. "I should have said it sooner, but I'm saying it now. I love you, Henry Dalton, not because you're my husband or because you saved the ranch, but because you're you, patient and kind and stronger than anyone I've ever known. And I'm grateful every day that you answered my advertisement." Henry set down his hammer and walked to the porch, climbed the steps, and pulled her into his arms. "I love you too," he murmured into her hair. "God, Beatrice, I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "Good scared or bad scared?" "Good scared. The kind that makes you want to be better, do better, build something that lasts." He pulled back to look at her, his eyes bright. "We're going to make it, this ranch, this life. We're going to make it work." "I know." Thus, and she did know, with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic or practicality, and everything to do with the man standing before her, solid and sure. "One step at a time, right?" "One step at a time," Henry agreed, and kissed her as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, a promise of better days ahead. But spring also brought unexpected news. In early April, Beatrice realized she'd missed her monthly courses, then missed them again. By the 3rd week, she was certain, and the knowledge filled her with a complex mix of joy and terror. A baby. They were going to have a baby. She told Henry one evening after dinner, simply and directly, and watched his face transform through a dozen emotions in as many seconds: shock, joy, fear, wonder. "A baby," he breathed. "We're having a baby. Are you happy?" "Happy?" Henry laughed, a sound of pure incredulous delight. "Beatrice, I'm terrified. I don't know the first thing about being a father. But yes, I'm happy. So happy I can barely think straight." He pulled her close, careful now in a way he hadn't been before, as though she'd suddenly become fragile. Beatrice smiled against his chest, feeling the steady thump of his heart, and thought about the future. Not the distant, abstract future, but the immediate, tangible one. A child. Their child. A new life built from their unlikely partnership. "We'll figure it out," she said, "like we figured out everything else." "One step at a time," Henry murmured, and there was such love in his voice that Beatrice felt tears spill down her cheeks, though whether from happiness or hormones or simple overwhelming emotion she couldn't have said. That night, as they lay in bed, Henry's hand resting gently on her still flat stomach, Beatrice thought about how far they'd come from that awkward meeting at the train station. They'd been strangers bound by necessity, and they'd become partners bound by respect, and now they were something more. A family, fragile but real, built step by careful step on a foundation of honesty and work, and the kind of love that grew slowly but rooted deep. Outside, the Montana night was alive with the sounds of spring, frogs calling from the creek, owls hunting in the darkness, the wind whispering through new grass. Inside, 2 people held each other in the darkness, preparing for whatever came next, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. One step at a time. Always one step at a time. And that, Beatrice thought as sleep finally claimed her, was enough. Spring turned the Montana prairie into a sea of green dotted with wildflowers, And with each passing week, Beatrice's body changed in ways both wonderful and terrifying. By May, she could no longer hide her condition, and the news spread through Red Valley with the speed of wildfire. Reactions varied. Some women offered congratulations tinged with pity, as though bearing a child to a man like Henry was somehow tragic. Others were genuinely warm, offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes. Martha Henderson knitted a blanket of soft blue wool and pressed it into Beatrice's hands with tears in her eyes, saying only, "Every child deserves to be welcomed." Henry threw himself into preparing for the baby with the same methodical determination he brought to every task. He built a cradle from oak, carving animals into the headboard, horses and cattle and birds in flight. He reinforced the porch railing and fixed every loose floorboard in the house, as though making it physically safer could somehow protect the tiny life growing inside Beatrice. And every night, he would place his hand on her growing belly and talk to the child in a soft voice, telling stories about the ranch, about his hopes for the future, about how loved this baby already was. "You're going to be a wonderful father," Beatrice told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "I'm going to try," Henry said. "That's all I can promise. To try my best and hope it's enough." "It will be enough. You're enough, Henry. You've always been enough." But as summer approached, bringing with it the suffocating heat that made Beatrice's pregnancy even more uncomfortable, news arrived that shattered their peaceful preparations. Tom Henderson rode out to the ranch one morning in early June, his face grave. "Got word from Wyoming," he said without preamble. "Jake Morrison's coming back. Samuel tried to keep him there, but the boy's 24 years old and his own man. Can't be held against his will." Beatrice felt her stomach drop. "When?" "Week, maybe 2. Samuel sent word as a warning. Says he'll try to keep Jake under control, but—" Tom shrugged helplessly. "Just thought you should know." After Tom left, Beatrice found Henry in the barn, told him the news. She watched the light fade from his eyes, saw his shoulders sag under the weight of renewed threat. "He won't have changed," Henry said quietly. "Men like Jake don't change. They just get better at hiding what they are. Maybe Samuel will keep him in line." "Maybe." But Henry didn't sound convinced. "We should prepare anyway, just in case." Preparation, in this case, meant vigilance. Henry began sleeping in the barn again, keeping watch through the long summer nights. Beatrice hated it, hated the separation, hated the constant fear, hated that Jake Morrison's hatred could reach across hundreds of miles and poison their happiness. But she understood necessity, and she didn't argue. Jake returned to Red Valley on a Tuesday in mid-June, and by Wednesday, everyone knew he was back. Cowboys who'd been friendly to the Daltons suddenly found reasons to avoid conversation. The atmosphere in town shifted, becoming tense and watchful, as though the whole community was holding its breath waiting for something terrible to happen. But days passed, then a week, and Jake made no move. Beatrice saw him once from a distance outside the saloon and was struck by how much thinner he looked. Wyoming hadn't been kind to him. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and there was something feral about him now, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "He's watching us," Henry said one morning at breakfast. "I've seen him riding the property line. Never comes close enough to confront, just watches. That's almost worse than if he'd just attack. It's deliberate. He's trying to make us nervous, make us make mistakes." Henry pushed his eggs around his plate, his appetite clearly gone. "Problem is, it's working." The waiting was exhausting, grinding them down by degrees. Beatrice, now 7 months pregnant, found it increasingly difficult to work, and Henry was stretched thin trying to manage the ranch alone while also keeping watch. They were both running on too little sleep and too much fear, and it was beginning to show. The break came on a sweltering afternoon in late June. Beatrice was in the kitchen preserving vegetables when she heard Sally whinnying in distress from the barn. Henry was out checking the north fence, wouldn't be back for another hour. She grabbed a kitchen knife, the only weapon readily available, and hurried outside as fast as her pregnant body would allow. Jake Morrison stood in the barn doorway, and he'd set fire to a pile of hay just inside. The flames were small still, but growing, smoke already filling the structure. Sally and the 2 draft horses were screaming in their stalls, trapped by the burning hay that blocked their escape route. "Jake!" Beatrice's voice came out as a croak. "What are you doing?" He turned to face her, and she saw immediately that something was wrong with him. His eyes were too bright, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Drunk, she thought at first, but then realized it was worse than that. He was drunk and unhinged, whatever thin veneer of civilization he'd possessed, now completely stripped away. "Making things right," he said, his words slurred. "Your fat husband took everything from me, my pride, my father's respect, even got me sent away like a child. Time to pay the debt. The horses haven't done anything to you. Let them out." "Let them out?" Jake laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "They'll die just like everything else you love, the barn, the animals, and then—" His eyes traveled to her swollen belly. "That abomination you're carrying should thank me, really, doing the world a favor, making sure there's no more freaks like Dalton running around." Terror flooded through Beatrice, sharp and clarifying. She'd been afraid before, but this was different. This was a man threatening her unborn child, and something primal rose up in her, something fierce and utterly unafraid. "Get away from my barn," she said, her voice steel. "For what? You gonna stop me? You're as helpless as those horses." Jake pulled a flask from his pocket, took a long drink. "Go ahead and try. I'd love an excuse." But Beatrice wasn't looking at Jake anymore. She was looking past him, at the massive figure that had appeared silently behind him. Henry must have seen the smoke, must have run the entire distance from the north fence because he was breathing hard, his face flushed with exertion and his eyes blazing with an anger Beatrice had never seen before. "Jake," Henry said, his voice low and dangerous. "Step away from the fire." Jake spun around, stumbled, caught himself. "The freak appears. Come to save your precious barn. Little late for that." Henry moved past Jake without another word, grabbed a horse blanket and began beating out the flames. The fire was still small enough to contain the hay not yet fully caught. Jake watched for a moment, then kicked at the burning pile, trying to spread it. "Don't," Henry warned, not looking up from his work. "Or what? What are you going to do, fat man? Sit on me?" Henry finished extinguishing the last of the flames, dropped the singed blanket, and turned to face Jake. There was something in his posture that made Beatrice's breath catch, a controlled violence, a promise of force held in careful check. "I'm going to give you one chance to walk away," Henry said quietly. "One chance to leave this property and never come back. After that, I'm not responsible for what happens." Jake pulled a knife from his belt, the blade catching the sunlight. "I don't think so. I think I'm going to finish what I started. Burn this barn, burn your house, and send you and your wife running. And if you try to stop me," he gestured with the knife, "I'll say you attacked me first. Self-defense. Who you think people will believe? The town drunk's word against a Morrison?" "They'll believe the truth," said a new voice. Samuel Morrison stood at the barn entrance, and he wasn't alone. Behind him were Tom Henderson, Reverend Walsh, and half a dozen other men from town, all mounted, all watching Jake with expressions ranging from pity to disgust. "Father," Jake said, his bravado wavering, "this ain't what it looks like. It looks like you're threatening a pregnant woman with a knife after trying to burn down her barn." Samuel's voice was flat, emotionless in a way that was somehow more frightening than anger. "It looks like everything Tom Henderson told me, everything I didn't want to believe about my own son. They don't belong here. He's not a real man, and she's—" "Enough!" Samuel's command cracked like a whip. "You're done, Jacob. Done in this family. Done in this territory. You're getting on a train east tonight, and you're never coming back. And if you fight me on this, I'll have the sheriff arrest you for arson and assault. Your choice." Jake looked around wildly, seeking support, finding none. Even his brothers, Pete and Tom, had ridden up with the group, wouldn't meet his eyes. The knife trembled in his hand. "Drop the weapon, son," Samuel said, more gently now. "Don't make this worse than it already is." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Jake's hand opened, the knife falling to the dirt with a dull thud. His face crumpled, and suddenly he looked less like a threat and more like a broken boy playing at being a man. "I just wanted to matter," he said, his voice cracking. "Wanted to be someone important." "You could have been," Samuel said sadly. "You had every opportunity, but you chose cruelty over character, and now you have to live with the consequences." Two of the Morrison hands dismounted and took Jake by the arms, leading him to a waiting horse. He didn't resist, all the fight gone out of him. As they rode away, Samuel turned to Henry and Beatrice. "I apologize," he said simply. "For my son, for my failure to see what he was becoming, for all of it. I'll pay for any damage to your property." "No need," Henry said, his anger draining away, leaving only exhaustion. "The fire didn't catch. We're all right." Nevertheless, Samuel pulled an envelope from his jacket. "Bank draft. For your troubles and for the herd you lost to his harassment last year. It's the least I can do." He handed the envelope to Beatrice, tipped his hat, and rode away. The other men followed, leaving the Daltons alone in the settling dust. Beatrice looked at Henry, saw her own shock reflected in his face. "Is it over?" she asked. "Is it really over?" "I think so." Henry sat down heavily on a hay bale, his hands shaking now with delayed reaction. "God, Beatrice, when I saw him threatening you, I know." She crossed to him, awkward with her pregnant belly, and wrapped her arms around him as best she could. "But we're safe now. We're finally safe." They held each other in the barn, surrounded by the smell of smoke and hay, and felt the weight of months of fear finally lifting. It wasn't quite over. Jake would have to actually leave. Samuel would have to keep his word. But for the first time since Henry had stepped off that train, Beatrice allowed herself to believe that they might actually build the life they'd been fighting for. The baby came on a hot August night, 2 weeks earlier than expected. Beatrice's water broke while she was making dinner, and the pain hit so hard and fast that she couldn't even call out. Henry, working on paperwork at the kitchen table, looked up and knew immediately. "I'll get the midwife," he said, already moving toward the door. "There's no time," Beatrice gasped. "Henry, there's no time. The baby's coming now." She saw panic flash across his face, quickly suppressed. All right, we can do this. Tell me what you need." They made it upstairs to the bedroom, and what followed was hours of agony and terror, and Henry's steady voice talking her through each contraction, his hands gentle but firm as he helped her through the most difficult thing she'd ever done. He'd never delivered a baby before, had only the vaguest idea of what was supposed to happen, but he stayed calm because Beatrice needed him to be calm. And when the baby finally came, a boy, squalling and red and absolutely perfect, Henry caught him with shaking hands and placed him on Beatrice's chest with a reverence usually reserved for holy relics. "A son," Beatrice whispered, exhausted beyond measure, but filled with wonder. "We have a son." Henry was crying openly, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his wife and child. "He's beautiful. God, Beatrice, he's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." They named him Daniel, after Beatrice's father, and Michael, after Henry's mother. Daniel Michael Dalton, born August 15, 1889, weighing 7 pounds and announcing his arrival with lungs that suggested he'd inherited his father's size and his mother's determination. The days that followed were a blur of sleeplessness and constant feeding and the overwhelming love that comes with caring for a tiny, helpless life. Henry proved to be a natural father, his gentleness perfectly suited to handling someone so fragile. He would walk the floor with Daniel for hours when the baby couldn't sleep, humming that same tuneless melody that now seemed to soothe the child the way it had once soothed the man. Word of the baby's birth spread through Red Valley, and to Beatrice's surprise, people came. Martha Henderson brought food and more blankets. Samuel Morrison sent a silver cup engraved with Daniel's name. Reverend Walsh visited to offer prayers and a leather-bound Bible for the boy. Even families who'd once avoided them now stopped by with gifts and congratulations, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, the Daltons became simply another family in the community, no more remarkable than any other. Autumn came, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Daniel grew fat and happy, his father's brown eyes and his mother's dark hair combining into something uniquely his own. The ranch prospered, the cattle had multiplied, the fences held strong, and the bank draft from Samuel Morrison had allowed them to buy seed stock and equipment they desperately needed. On a crisp October morning, almost exactly a year after the wedding, Henry and Beatrice stood on the porch together, watching Daniel sleep in his cradle while the sun rose over the prairie. Henry's arm was around her waist, her head on his shoulder, and everything felt right in a way that had seemed impossible just months ago. Do you remember what you said to me at the train station? Beatrice asked. That first day? Which part? I said a lot of stupid things. She smiled. You said you may not be fast, but you'd always get there. I remember. You were right. It took longer than either of us expected, and the road was harder than we could have imagined. But you got us here. You got us to this moment, to this life. She turned to look at him, this man who'd proven every cruel assumption wrong. You walked miles just to find me, Henry Dalton, and you've been finding me ever since. Henry's smile was soft, full of all the love he'd been offering since the beginning, waiting patiently for her to accept it. Well, sweetheart, it's a long road, but I don't mind the walk. They stood together as the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist. From inside the house came the sound of Daniel stirring, his small cries announcing his need for feeding. Beatrice moved to go to him, but Henry stopped her. Let me, he said. You stay here. Enjoy the morning. She watched him go inside, this massive man who moved so carefully around his tiny son, and felt her heart swell with a love so fierce it almost frightened her. They had built this life from nothing, from rejection and mockery and the simple, stubborn determination to survive. They had faced down cruelty and violence and the harsh Montana winters. They had done it together, one step at a time, and they had created something beautiful. Down the road, she could see neighbors traveling to town for Sunday services. The Morrison Ranch in the distance looked peaceful, its cattle dotting the hillsides. Smoke rose from chimneys across the valley as families prepared their breakfasts. It was ordinary and perfect, and everything she'd fought for. Henry emerged with Daniel, the baby now quiet against his father's broad chest, and they stood together on the porch, husband, wife, and child, watching the day begin. Henry started humming again, that tuneless melody that had become as familiar as breathing, and Daniel's eyes drifted closed, soothed by his father's voice and the safety of his arms. I love you, Beatrice said softly. Both of you. More than I ever thought possible. We love you too, Henry replied. Every single day, we love you too. And as the morning sun fell across the open plains of Montana Territory, the people of Red Valley went about their business, no longer whispering about the mail-order husband who was too fat to ride. Instead, if they spoke of the Daltons at all, it was with respect, for the man who'd built a life through patience and persistence, for the woman who'd seen past surface to substance, for the family they'd created against all odds. Henry Dalton was still too big for a saddle. His cart still drew occasional curious glances from strangers passing through. But for those who knew him, for those who'd watched him walk through blizzards and build through harassment and love through mockery, his size was the least interesting thing about him. What mattered was this. He'd made a promise to a woman in a letter, and he'd kept it. He'd said he'd always get there, and he had. Through every difficulty, every setback, every moment when quitting would have been easier, he'd taken the next step, and then the next, and then the next, until he'd walked himself right into the life he'd dreamed of, the family he'd longed for, the home he'd never dared to hope he'd find. One step at a time, slow and steady and sure, just like he'd always said, just like he'd always been. The sun climbed higher, warming the land, and inside the house, breakfast waited. There was work to be done. There was always work to be done. But for this moment, this perfect autumn morning, 3 people stood together on a porch in Montana, held each other close, and knew with absolute certainty that they were exactly where they belonged. And that was enough. More than enough. That was everything.